You know how hard they tried to wash us out of flight school? The colored flyers.
Your testimony's been entered, Lieutenant. You can step down.
There's a camp right outside of Macon, where I'm from, and there the Army sends the German POWs. Puts them to work picking cotton. But what's strange is every once in a while we'd see them walking through town, going to movies, eating in diners. But if I wanted to go to those same movies, I had to sit way off in the balcony. And those diners were closed to me, even in uniform. But German POWs were allowed to sit there and eat. And this must have happened to at least half the guys at Tuskegee. But the thing is, we just kept telling ourselves that no matter what, as long as we did our jobs, it'd all be worth it. Because, hey, the war would end, and we could go home and be free to walk down any street in America with our heads held high as men. So that's what we did. We did our jobs. We served our country, sir.
They served their country in Europe, while Jim Crow was the law at home and in the military. When they returned to America, they found that nothing had changed. The same segregation, and even worse, they could be beaten or lynched just for wearing their Army uniform. In 1944, the GI Bill was passed. It provided veterans with money for college, businesses, and home loans. But the Democrats and Republicans made sure most black veterans would be excluded from the benefits. It didn't matter if they served in combat or in a support role. The Tuskegee Airmen, the 92nd Infantry Division, 761st Tank Battalion, the women who served, it didn't matter if they'd been decorated for bravery. It would be difficult to cash in on the education grants. VA home loans would be even more difficult. While there was a white post-war housing boom, it almost entirely excluded black veterans in black neighborhoods. In 1947, only 2 of the more than 3,200 VA home loans in 13 Mississippi cities went to black borrowers. But it was the same up north. In New York and the northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill went to non-whites. The stage was set long before World War II.
And this is where you first see this racial language.
Caucasians only, Aryans only, no Negroes or no members of African blood or descent.
100% of them were aimed at black people.
In many ways, racial covenants, this is kind of ground zero of residential segregation. In the United States, and racism have a very, very long history, but this particular deployment of racism is fairly new, and this idea was really made material through instruments like racial covenants.
The law of the streets, the law of the courts working in consort to discourage blacks from moving into white neighborhoods.
It starts out as private property developers, but eventually you have the federal government encouraging these racial covenants, demanding actually that any investment they make is protected with this kind of racial exclusivity.
The federal government means the Democrats and the Republicans. They write the laws, create agencies to enforce them, then hide and let someone else take the blame for their mandates. The FHA was created in 1934. Their loan programs dramatically expanded home ownership.
Fortunately, as part of that, what the HOLC does is it establishes designations for neighborhoods based on the occupants of those neighborhoods.
And this is where the term redlining comes into place. The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining. Blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best. So areas that were predominantly African American or majority minority, or really in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. So when they built these maps, they also explained why each area got the ranking it did.
the area around 4th Avenue South, which is called the Old South Side. This was a nice area. It had nice homes. It's the historic African-American neighborhood on the south side of Minneapolis.
This one part of South Minneapolis was redlined specifically due to, and I'm quoting, a gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics. The FHA refused to give an area a green-lined designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That line's from the FHA underwriting manual.
This very persistent myth that northern cities never had formal segregation. The South had Jim Crow, and look at those signs. Well, racial covenants did the work of Jim Crow in the North, all over the North.
Since World War II veterans and the rest of the black population confined to a small area, public housing was created.
The 1935 land use planning map used to define which place would get mortgages versus others circled these areas, called them slums, places where the quote-unquote Negroes lived. These are places to avoid, right? So they're gonna give you substandard housing and they're gonna contain you. You have 400 units of public housing, which were segregated at the time, created. In 1953, the City Council of Minneapolis refused to scatter another 1,000 units of public housing outside of the Sumner Field Homes area. And where did these pressures come from? You had both internal conservative politicians and outlying suburban communities coming in saying, not in my neighborhood. And the City Council crumbled under the pressure and then took what was 400 units of public housing to over 1,000 units in less than a decade. They have strategically manufactured urban poverty.
As the population grew, they kept jamming more people into a small red-lined area with limited opportunity. Despite all the obstacles, they still created vibrant neighborhoods.
It's interesting it brought people together in one sense, and we were able to create our own community around 38th Street and 4th Avenue.
My dad and their family are originally from the Central neighborhood, and then he went to Central High School. And they tell me these stories just about what they called kind of the Black Mecca in the Central neighborhoods. When you talk about the problem, we're talking about it from a deficits-based language. I also want to make sure we're talking about an asset-based language.
Then the Democrats and Republicans struck again. They deliberately put the interstate highways right through these neighborhoods and destroyed much of what had been built, including the work of World War II veterans.
I mean, if your grandparents bought a home on Minnehaha Creek, that home's worth, what, $500,000? If your grandparents rented an area that was redlined and then subsequently destroyed by a freeway project, you're not inheriting anything.
This is a map of present-day Minneapolis. This is Chicago Avenue. This is where George Floyd was murdered. Nicollet Avenue, the freeway in between. This is a color-coded map of the 1930s. Chicago Avenue. This is where George Floyd was murdered. Nicollet Avenue, and the original Red Line neighborhood. Well, that's just about perfect. Slavery ended in 1865 and was replaced by Jim Crow. Jim Crow ended in the late 1960s, and in 1971 the war on drugs started. As the years passed, there were more drug warriors and more drug laws. Today we have 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population, and 33% of the female prison population. We incarcerate people 5 times faster than China, 10 times faster for African Americans. If the Chinese government is as evil as our leaders claim they are, what does that say about our country? All this is how America thanked Black World War II veterans for their service.
Bedford. That's a nigga you rooting for. Tails painted red means he's 99th, right out of Tuskegee, boy.
There was a bill introduced in Congress, the GI Bill Repair Act of 2020. This bill provides eligibility for VA home loans in the post 9/11 GI Bill to Black World War II veterans, their spouse, and all direct descendants who are living of the date of the enactment of this bill. There are 535 members of Congress. Only 33 support the bill so far. Not one Republican. Question for the Republicans: who disrespects veterans more? Is it the athlete who takes a knee during the national anthem? Or is it members of Congress who insist on cheating World War II veterans out of their GI Bill benefits? There are 275 Democrats in Congress. They can pass this great bill without any help from the Republicans. If you want to help World War II veterans finally get what has been owed to them for over 75 years, share this video and contact any Democrat who hasn't supported this bill and demand they do the right thing and help get this passed before they lose control of Congress to the Republicans. It's the right thing to do and long overdue.